my girl and I go out and join the park parade. Arm in arm we stroll along, a happy man and maid.
Welcome to the second episode of Battlefront's podcast Collecting War. I am Nicolai De Bono, and today I am here with Mr. Stephen A. Petroni. Mr. Petroni is of course, a long-time figure in the collecting community in Malta, especially when it comes to the Second World War and firearms and much more. There's a lot to introduce, but I think I will let him do that job himself. So, welcome to the podcast, Mr. Petroni. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and where you started off as a collector?
First of all, thank you for this occasion, for the invitation. It's an excellent idea. It's, I think, the best way of reaching out to people who may not understand the passion that we have. In my case, my interest stemmed entirely from history. I've always loved history whenever even at school. That was one of my favorite topics. But the crossing the bridge from being very keen on history to actually collecting happened in quite an unusual way, really. I remember this was during my college days. It was during the break. I decided to go for a walk because another passion of mine is architecture. I love architecture. So I frequently went out for walks during the break just to look at buildings, sketch them, buildings that caught my fancy. But one time I remember I was walking past this antique shop in Attard, and I decided to walk in. I just wanted to have a look. I was curious. And amongst the things that were on display there were a few helmets. And one of them was a helmet that I recognized as an Italian helmet, a World War II Italian helmet from the Marines. And I don't know, I think you can say it was love at first sight. So I felt something about that piece. I felt something about the history, how it actually came to Malta, why it was there. And I wanted to own it. But this was in my student days. I didn't have the money to do it. But some exams were coming up. And as is the norm here, parents would tell you, listen, what would you want if you get a good result in your exams? And I said, a helmet. And there was a pause, and my dad said, and what about the bike? I said, no, there's no bike. It's just the helmet. It's a World War II helmet. And that's what happened. So it's still, that first piece of my collection, it's still very significant in my view. But it's one of those things when you see something and it talks to you. And that's exactly what happened then. And being the first piece, being the only piece that I owned at the time, I gave it a lot of attention, obviously. So I was doing a lot of research. I was trying to find out how it could have come to Malta. And I think this is what set me on this path, that it's not about the object, but it is your relationship with that object and what you can get out of it in terms of research, in terms of knowledge, but also, very importantly, how to care for an object. Because at the end of the day, no matter the size of the item or the importance, from a historical perspective, every piece is important. Every piece tells a story. So the conservation, the proper conservation of even the most, what could appear to be really insignificant, is important. And it didn't happen overnight. This was a learning curve. This was just the spark which ignited this passion. That's what happened. So then eventually, I had to overcome that urge which most new collectors tend to suffer from, and that is, you have something which is historic. It obviously has the wear and tear of all those years, and at the back of your mind you want it to look much better than it actually is. So that was the first urge that I had to fight, that it's not about having something that looks good, but having something that really bears the scars of history. Cleaning it, taking care of it, conserving it, but not actually repainting it or doing anything of the sort. So It was a learning curve, as I said, but it was the start of it all. That's how it happened.
You speak of this helmet and other things in your collection, like they're sort of animate, like they spoke to you, they bear scars, they're like living things. Do you think that that's something that you brought to you carried on to this day in collecting?
It's solely intensified because when I see an object, it's not just the object, it's the person behind the object. So when you said, listen, you're treating it like as if it were a live item, well, yes, because it is an extension really of the person who wore it, the person who used it. I see people in these things. That to me is extremely important. In fact, I think one of the areas which really excites me is when you have an object which has a very strong link to a particular person. And now that person need not be a high-ranking officer, or it could be the man in the street, but it tells the story of that person. So to me, it is extremely important. And the conservation of such objects is really the remembrance of these people. That is why I am so much against destruction of historical artifacts. And it's not a joke when I say this. Yes, it's happening. It's happening now as we speak. And it's not happening from individuals, but it's happening from governments. We have all over the world governments that destroy historical heritage simply because of regulations in the country. We'll come to that later. I'll explain myself better.
Okay, so it's interesting that you see objects sort of not because of themselves, but because they connect you to a person. So they're sort of like they transport you to the past as well. Maybe if I can even say that. So do you feel that how do we come to terms with the fact that we're owning other people's things, if not other people's memories?
Well, yes. To me, it's a very satisfying thought, very satisfying feeling. At the end of the day, my objective is to acquire, to clean, to preserve, to research, to complete the story of the subject to its full extent. One day, somebody else has to take that over. So I always say that a collector really is a curator. The only difference between a collector and a curator is that one is being paid for the job, and the other person is paying to do all this. So it's just a question of the money involved.
So for you, it's like you model yourself as a museum does.
Yes, 100%.
Okay.
100%. There's no other way. In my view, there is no other way if you want to do this seriously.
So when you're saying that you see yourself as an individual as a museum, can you explain that better, maybe?
Well, I mean, what is the role of a museum? The role of a museum is acquiring, as I said before, researching, conserving, passing it on. Every person, every citizen of our country, but even internationally, has a right of access to these objects. It is everybody's right to appreciate them. So when we're doing this, both as collectors, as private collectors, or as museums, at the end of the day, the objective is exactly the same. I can actually say that collectors go one step further, because collector's passion, which is something which is, you can't become a museum curator. It's not a job. You don't say, okay, let me see what jobs are out on the market. Okay, this seems like a good one. Let me go for that. It's not like that. If you don't have the passion, then it's not your job. Now, that is obviously for a private collector, but it also applies to museum curators. And when you have a museum curator who has that passion, and we do know a few, thankfully, who do have that passion, you can see it in the way they bring out the items, in the way they research the items, in the way they communicate with other people. The passion is in their eyes. You can see it. And that passion is very, very, they pass it on to you. It's something which, once a person speaks with passion, it's very easy to be caught up in it as well. And that's the job of a curator, really. That's the way I see it. In the case of private collectors, they do go one step further. In the research, they do. Now, it doesn't mean that museum curators don't do research, but it's a job. In the case of the private collector who has that passion and really has that drive to research, it's a daily thing, and it happens at every time of the day and at every time of the night. Sometimes I'll wake up early and the thought crosses my mind, something, it's that eureka moment. Okay, I go down to my library, start digging out books and finding something about that particular item, which I wanted to know something about. And this is reflected, this passion for research, in the amount of publications that are authored by private collectors. In fact, I always believe that there should be an extremely good relationship, contact between private collectors, serious private collectors, and museums, because we stand to learn a lot from each other. Now, I've been in situations where museum curators will brush off a private collector saying, okay, but he doesn't have, some university degree or hasn't done this course or anything of the sort. But it doesn't make sense, because at the end of the day, I always tell curators who have this attitude, may I visit your library, please? And they say, why? I'd like to see what books you have. I go into the library, then I'll point out the shelves and I say, you see, all the books you've got in that room, over 90% of them are written by private collectors. And that's a fact. That is a fact, because the individual collector can go into detail. You can have collectors that are very specialist in a particular topic, so their entire focus is on that item or on that group of items, and what comes out of their research is far, far more detailed than anything you can find in even the bigger museums. So that's why I say that this relationship between private museums and private collections is extremely important.
Something that I need to clarify. So when you say serious from non-serious collectors, what is the definition?
Okay, that's a very valid point. Nobody starts off as a serious collector, although I would say that the passion will be there. I am in a bit of a unique position to meet a lot of collectors and a lot of people who are interested in acquiring something, but I can see that there is a huge difference between a collector and another collector, and there is this term which is used. There's a hoarder, a person who simply has this insatiable appetite to acquire things. But unfortunately, once acquired, these things go in a showcase or in a box or somewhere, but it stops there. There is no research, there is no study, conservation may not be entirely up to scratch. So yes, not everybody is the same, and not everybody starts as a very serious collector. Where does that happen? It's difficult to say. It depends on the person. I think that if a person is very passionate about the topic and is already buying books and doing a lot of research, then that person is already on the road to being a serious collector. And again, the term, I'm not applying this term to quantity. It has nothing to do with quantity. I can think of a few collectors that have a small collection, a very small, very modest collection, but the research which they have done on their items and the way that they have tried to complete their collection by adding on ancillary items that enhance the historic aspect of that item, as opposed to somebody who has a lot of items, massive collection, but hardly does any research. So it's not about quantity. Serious collecting is not about quantity. It's not about walking into a room and finding it jam-packed and you can't move around. You say, wow, this is a really large collection. Yeah, it's a very large accumulation, but I would like to see the research involved. That is something which I'm very dedicated to, and it's something which I try to pass on to others.
It's almost as if you're saying that collecting it's not really about collecting, it's about getting to know the items that come into your possession, no?
I think so. I feel that way, at least. It's certainly not owning pieces for decoration. disowning pieces for decoration is historically quite interesting.
A lot of
And it
collections
goes back
started as decorations.
And it goes, exactly, and it goes back a long time, very long time. So you'd have, I don't know, stately homes where the owners would have bought arms and armor from auctions or whatever, but the whole objective is to plaster them on the walls and make them look pretty, you know. So yes, it's an impressive display, but I can't really call it a collection, but that's how it started. And here in Malta in particular, this, how should I say, this aspiration to have military items and hang them on the wall is very, very strong. In fact, I'm sure you've done it as well, Nick. If you go to people's homes, I'm not talking about collectors, people's homes, invariably you're always going to find a bayonet hanging on the wall, or an old rifle, or a hunting shotgun, or some shells which are on the ground.
Armor.
Yeah, these items have very frequently been used as decorative trophies, and they're originals. And I try to educate people in this manner that, yes, if they want to decorate their house with such items, they might as well buy reproductions and hang them on the wall and make sure that these original items are better conserved. So, especially in a country like ours where the atmosphere is very humid and the walls can soak up a lot of damp and we have dust, it's very, very dangerous to hang things on the wall. That's something which should never be done, really. If you want to conserve something, that's one place where they should never ever be.
Why? It's a question I have a lot, and maybe you have some answers to it that obviously don't have answers, but you might have some of your own that you think are valid. Why do you think you just mentioned people buy a lot of militaria to hang on walls and stuff, and it's very common, as you were saying, I've seen it many times. Why militaria, not something else?
Yes, that's a very, very interesting question, which I've asked myself over and over again. I think the appeal of arms and militaria goes beyond a lot of very important artistic items, paintings and things like that. Why? Yeah, there's a painting by a famous artist, it's hanging in your sitting room, it's a lovely piece, it's a good investment, but it's not a trophy. It's not a trophy. Militaria tends to have the status of a trophy, especially if it's something which is captured. So, you know how it is, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. So if we're here in Malta, and we're obviously interested in Maltese history and whatever came here, but there's obviously a very strong interest in the enemy side. Why? Because the enemy side, the stuff would be rarer, more difficult to acquire, and it is also always something outside of the ordinary. So there's a bigger appeal to have something which comes from, let's say, if we're talking World War II, something which comes from the Luftwaffe, for instance, or something which comes from the Regia Aeronautica, the Italian Air Force. These are highly prized, and I've seen this in people, that when they have, I don't know, a flare gun from a German aircraft hanging on the wall, there is almost a greater sense of ownership, in the sense that, okay, this is a trophy, this is from a plane that was shot down over Malta. Now I own it, it's hanging on my wall.
So do you think there's a connection between this? I really like this idea of having a trophy. Do you think that it's all about having something that you should not have, that excitement?
Not that you should not have, really, but it's more like this must be something really inherent in human beings. I think it's something that goes in really deep, you know, almost like a how should I say, when you have something which you do automatically, and sometimes you don't even realize why. But if you go back to World War II and what people were doing in World War II, whenever an aircraft was shot down or crashed, you got a number of people who used to rush to that wreck and collect something and take it home. And a lot of things survived that way. My late father had done that as a kid, you know. I mean, he was a teenager. He missed conscription by air, but he had, whenever there was a plane that was shot down, he used to race off in my grandfather had a motorcycle with sidecar. They'd rush off, pick whatever they could as souvenirs, and take them back home. And he was conserving them. Ironically, he lost them all when a bomb hit their garage, because that's where they were.
Jesus.
So yeah, I mean, otherwise, they'd be with me today.
That's very interesting. So we're not speaking about them as things that we should not own, but just this inherent idea of possessing.
I think so.
And one of the critique I have about myself and about collecting in general is that I think that some people just want to own their part of history. Maybe you could comment on that.
It is, absolutely. It is.
So, for example, I buy a Luger just so I can own a piece of the story, like a relic.
Yeah.
A relic, maybe.
Yeah. That's very strong. That's extremely strong.
So you would agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. It happens, especially in terms of arms and militaria, because of movies about World War I and World War II. People can relate to them a lot. And there are things which are recognizable even by people who know extremely limited. Everybody will recognize a Luger, everybody will recognize a German helmet, everyone will recognize a Tommy helmet. Why? Because it's not just in the books. It's not only people who do the research, but watching movies, I want to have something which I saw in that movie, which was carried by a particular actor. So, yes, it happens that way.
And do you think that sometimes we trivialize the objects? What I mean is that, for example, let's take an example of myself. I collect mostly shells and then aircraft shells and ammunition. Sometimes I find a shell and I put it in my room, and sometimes I look at it and I say, this shell was probably fired during the war. Why was it doing in my room? Who am I to actually own it,
No, I wouldn't say you are trivializing it by owning it, because at the end of the day, if you're taking care of doing the research, of conserving it, we are curators. Sooner or later, that's going to be either in another collection or in a museum. If you take the world's largest collections, they started off as private collections. So that is the reality. And that's why governments should be extremely open to serious collectors, because that is their future source for enhancing the country's heritage.
So for you, as long as you take care of the object and give it the respect, or by actually researching it, that's the whole point.
I would add just one other thing. Today we have the opportunity of reaching out to people who don't even meet. And I'm talking about the internet. So writing about an object and putting it up on the net is fantastic, because you are sharing it with other people, you're giving people an insight into the object. It works differently for different viewers. So there may be the fellow who's looking at it and says, wow, this is a really interesting story. I didn't know this. There's the other fellow who could be doing some research, and you've given him that missing link, the one bit of information which he needs to complete his own story. I enjoy this a lot when I put information. As you know, I write practically daily articles on which I post to our Facebook page, and to me, it's a mission. Sometimes it can be repetitive, because obviously I'm writing about a pistol, and I had a similar pistol, up a couple of years ago. Most of the text will be the same, but then there'll be that particular bit of information that relates solely to that pistol which I'm featuring in the photographs. So yes, that dissemination of information is something which I would say it's a small price to pay for actually owning it.
That's a good way of putting it, I think, yes. Something else that you mentioned, that of course we do research, we do collecting, but I think we're always dancing around the point that we don't only collect things, we collect antiques, and more specifically militaria. So could you analyze yourself and tell us what motivates you to collect old things, so things maybe that you from past lifetimes, and specifically militaria yourself?
Well, as I said before, Nick, I started off with an Italian helmet, and that more or less set the stage for an interest in World War II items, which then went back to World War I, which then advanced a little bit further to the post-war years, which then went all the way back to flintlocks. There's no part. It doesn't mean that when you collect, you're doing it chronologically. Sometimes you just come across an item, and it opens your mind to a totally new world. And if you are inquisitive, like me, I'm very inquisitive, very curious about, knowing something about it. I'm not just going to get something and leave it there and look at it. I really want to know everything about it. I'm going to take that item apart. I'm going to study it. I'm going to take photographs. I'm going to do my research. So yeah, I mean, if I take my particular case as an example, but by all means, I'm not saying that this is how one should go about it. I'm just saying how it happened with me. So it started with this military object. My next item was a firearm, which until that time, so I was 11 at the time, right? When this happened, I obviously could not own the firearm because I was not of age to have a license. So it was transferred to my father's name, and it came into my hands in an interesting way. I happened to befriend an SAS officer who lived in our area. We became very good friends, and he realized that I was very keen on the subject. He used to take me to the ranges. No, actually, I skipped a step. He used to take me to the armory at Pembroke. Okay, it was the 41 Commando Group at the time. We used to go into the armory. He used to say, okay, which ones would you like to shoot? And we'd go to the range and actually shoot them. That was a massive experience for me. And he had just come to Malta, and one of his last postings had been Borneo. And over there he picked up a Nambu pistol, a Japanese Nambu pistol. And before he left Malta, he sold it to me. So that was my first firearm. So an Italian helmet and a Japanese pistol. And that got me interested in firearms. So I was already collecting medals and uniforms and documents. But the firearms were a completely different ballgame, totally. And maybe if we have some time, I can explain why it was such a challenge.
Before we go into that, I just wonder, for example, obviously collecting is a huge thing. There are people that collect shoes, people that collect magazines. Collectors are a very wide array. But I always wonder, like, what motivates us to collect old things? For me, personally, I feel like maybe out of nostalgia. Some people collected just so they can connect to relatives in the past. So there's an element of nostalgia, an element maybe that it doesn't feel like we are living in any time right now, and we always look back because back then there are we romanticize the past. But then more than that, antique militaria, maybe there's a sort of allure of collecting things military because of the things you read and
the age of the items.
Yeah, so before we go into firearms, which is a big topic, especially discussing it with you, maybe something about why you think we collect antiques, specifically old things.
Again, it's one of those questions which I've asked myself, and I can put it in very few words. The objects are the fuel of my time machine.
Okay, can you explain that better?
Okay, so basically, traveling back in time. Obviously, not if I could travel back in time, it would be an extremely large collection. But
where would you go? Quickly, just side note.
I don't know. I would probably skip from one era to another. I don't know where I'd end up. But in reality, okay, I explained it in this way because the object helps me to go back in time. It's something which I love. I love history. I love our roots, our background, where we come from, how the history of the world changed sometimes over what seemed as a small incident. I'm fascinated by all this. I'm fascinated by man's role in all this. And I'm also fascinated by how history can be changed, basically by one man. Somebody who really sets the world off in a totally different direction. And the objects are very much part of it, because no matter which part of history you connect to, you like, that object reflects the personality of the time, it reflects the nation. I always say that, especially in firearms, well, even in military, obviously, but that is a little bit obvious. But in firearms, sometimes people don't understand me when I tell them this. If I look at a firearm, I immediately think of a country. It's not because I know that firearm belongs to that country, but you can feel the culture and the the style of the country in that design. It's there. It's there. Today it's different. Today, in today's world, many things just look the same wherever they come from. It's just that the technology has caught up. And I feel it happened in the way that technology has caught up. So basically, this information is shared, and whatever is produced will be very similar across the world. So we're losing that individuality of the design, of previous designs. So I don't know if I answered your question that way, but that helps me go back in time and really dig and understand.
For example, sometimes you pick up an antique and it has a certain smell, or even surplus.
Yes.
So even like tangibly, you can tell it's from the past, you know?
Totally. It's all the senses. It's vision, okay? It's the feel, it's the smell. Noise, well, hopefully not a ticking bomb. But yes. All the senses come in. All the senses come in, definitely. It's all part of it.
So so when you pick up something like from the past, you can feel it's from the past, like tangibly.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know, maybe, have you ever thought about like the concept of aura, like things have a certain aura around them, not mystically, but like you feel like they represent a certain absence. So if there's a helmet of a German soldier, you feel his absence through it.
I do. I really do. And there are some objects which, when especially those that have a very personal story, when I see them or handle them, I am almost emotional about it. I can really feel it, especially when you're talking about young people who lost their lives at a ridiculous age.
Do you have something in mind that makes you feel that way?
Yes, there are loads of things in my collection which have that aura, that link, and I can think of one item now which we saw recently when we had the exhibition. So when the Italians were bombing Malta, besides dropping bombs, they also dropped messages for the RAF, which the RAF would read. And these messages would have been something like on the lines like, okay, we'd like to inform you that 2 of your pilots crashed in Sicily. One of them was killed. The other one is in good health. We're taking good care of him. Now, can we please ask about this pilot who we lost on that particular day? Can you tell us if he's okay? And the RAF would answer back. So this happened, and this happened at the height of war. Now, this was not, I wouldn't say it was officially sanctioned. This is more like an Air Force speaking to an Air Force, like a sailor would speak to a sailor, in spite of them being on opposite sides. There is that feeling that it is basically, he's another one like you. So when you see something like that, and you're seeing this correspondence, and they're asking about the pilot, and then the British have answered, yes, that they found this pilot, but he was dead. And then you go into the research of finding out who this pilot was, and you find people who are, very young age. I mean, well below 30 at times. So, yes, there's this very strong emotional link.
Would it be fair to say that you empathize with the humanity of the object, sort of the humanity or the human nature or the human condition shown
100%,
in them?
100%.
So it's more than just military. It's like
100%.
It's like understanding some very deep things about ourselves as humans through these things.
Yeah. I mean, I look at an object, especially when you're talking about firearms now, you have so many different facets which are involved. So if you're talking about the firearm and the history of the firearm and how it was conceived and how it was designed, but then you actually have the industrial history, how that factory came to produce it, what was required to produce it, what were the politics behind the production of that gun and not another gun. This happens all the time, even to this very day. You have elements like the designers and arguments between designers. So, one designer does one thing, the other guy improves upon it. So these two designers aren't on good terms together. Time and time again, this has happened. There is the actual quality and fit and finish of the item. So you can see when people were building firearms. I'm quoting firearms because obviously this is very technical.
Yes.
Where you can say, okay, compare it to a firearm today, which is mass produced. they were trying to mass produce these firearms, but there was still a lot of hand finishing, hand fitting. So that's in the manufacture of the item. Then you go into the use. It arrives in army stores or Air Force stores, whatever, it's issued to a particular soldier, to an officer. And then another history starts, the history of that piece in use. It's never ending, Nick. There's so much. You can get out of it, you can get as much out of it as you want, literally.
That's a good way of putting it, I would say, yes. Obviously, you're a firearms collector, among things you collect. A lot of people, I think, misunderstand firearm collectors, and that's something you, I'm sure, will be able to comment on. But what I would like to ask you is, even I have some firearms in my collection as well. Sometimes if I look at, for example, something from a piece of shrapnel from the war, I say, okay, that happened and I picked it up, or if I pick up a shell, or if I pick up a newspaper, that has this particular connection to the war. But when I pick up a firearm, I think someone, especially who hasn't even seen firearms, will say, okay, that's something, an object that killed someone. So, and it might be true. So how do we explain our passion to firearms given this fact?
Well, yes, any firearm can have its let's say, its dark history. At the end of the day, when nations went to war and they built, I'm not just talking about firearms, but anything from a pistol to a tank, the objective was to destroy, to kill. That's true. But I reconcile that with the fact that whatever is in my collection, that history is past. I've now conserved it after this use was made of it. Whatever it is, it may have been used in war, it may not have been used directly in war, it may have been used just in training. But I reconcile it in this manner. That's over. It's now in a collection. From this point on, it's not going to be used for this purpose. It's going to be used for research, for collecting. Maybe it will be in a museum one day. So I don't see any issue over there, to tell you the truth. On the contrary, I see it as something that is now in the hands of somebody who is treating it for its history, for its link to humanity. It's a completely different situation. So no, I personally, I do not see any issue. But I do have, on the other hand, I do feel the emotion of knowing who that pistol belonged to. If I can know it, it doesn't always happen. And I managed to find out something about it which tells me about that person. Then yes, then I see that person. But I can never see the person who was in front of the muzzle. I can only see the person who's holding the firearm. There's no way of knowing that.
Mm-hmm. Some people that might come to your collection will tell you, okay, fine, that's a valid point. But they might also say, I couldn't be able to do that. I couldn't be able to own something that I know might have killed someone. So obviously, I empathize with what you said, but why do you think that we see it that way and other people don't?
No, I think that stems from another, for another reason, to tell you the truth, Nick. It's not about that. I think that stems from the fact that ignorance breeds fear. So the majority of people who would argue that way probably have never even had the opportunity to handle a historic firearm, or much less research it. So I have always found that a person who is introduced into this fascinating world of collecting, and especially firearms are concerned, when they can understand what it's all about, provided that they have that disposition to learn. Because there are some people who are, it's not a question of them not knowing, that's something I concede to anybody, but there are people who just don't want to open, their minds. They're set in their ways and that's it. Those are impossible. It's pointless, absolutely pointless. But when there's somebody who's willing to learn, I have always found from experience that we crossed every single barrier. There was absolutely no problem.
You are also in the unique position of making collectors, because of course you sell and purchase firearms and militaria and a lot of things. So how does it feel to sometimes be the first person to start a collection, and how do you direct someone to the right frame of mind towards collecting?
That is a very satisfying feeling. Yes, I've been in that position, and I am still in that position. Sometimes you get people who are interested in a topic, but they just don't know where to start from. And rather than telling them where to start from, I try to understand what drives them, what is, where their passion comes from. Because once I know where their passion comes from, it's then simpler for me to tell them, okay, so I suggest you start off with this, However, again, I draw the line between militaria and firearms. Why? Because firearms, to even collect firearms, you need to have a collector license. And to get that collector license, there is, or should I say, there ought to be a standard way of doing it. Regretfully, we don't yet have that in our law. The concept, when I was involved in the drafting of the law, was that a person who's coming into the world of firearms, whether to target shoot or to collect, you'd need to pass him through a process, or her through a process. We have lots of ladies collectors, by the way, so nothing new. But people need to be passed through a process whereby they appreciate what they're doing it for. And at the end of the day, I make them ask themselves the question is whether they really want to do it. I don't like people who come into this in a very lukewarm way. So somebody who is passionate, I encourage a lot, but somebody who's just doing it, like it's a hobby. Hobbies are something which you acquire and lose the sense for a particular hobby. And this is not. This is a passion. This is something which is lifetime. So if you're going to go into it, you have to go into it in a way which where you have to make sacrifices. You have to understand this, and you have to be selective. You have to try and build on a particular theme. So yes, there's a lot of guidance involved, and it's not because, okay, you mentioned the shop, but it's not because of that. It's also because I firmly believe that we need people in the community who have the right attitude to collecting. It is our future. And when I say our future, not our future as a community, our future for conservation. These are the people we need. These are tomorrow's very serious collectors, tomorrow's best possible curators. So it's a mission at the end of the day.
So when you're selling a firearm to an individual, I believe, as you're saying, it's more than just selling a firearm. It's you're starting a path. You're instructing someone.
Yes.
It's more than just a transaction.
Oh yes. And it's also about teaching that person and letting him know about the pitfalls that exist, how to watch out for fakes, which unfortunately exist in every sphere, how to be selective, how to choose the best. Yes, I feel very strongly about that, because there's nothing worse than going home with a trophy and putting it into your showcase, and you start doing your research, and then you start finding out, oh, but that's incorrect, and that is incorrect, and that is incorrect. That's the worst possible feeling. Every collector passes through it. Even I passed through it in my early days. But thankfully, I met the right people who set me on the correct path. And there's the news that you'd like to hear and the news that you don't like to hear, but you have to hear it anyway. So always be very open to people who know their topic and will tell you, listen, no go, this is not a good item, Some people don't want to hear that. They want to believe what they want to believe. And that's wrong. So I've seen, not many, thankfully, but a few collections which were built up without knowledge, which were built up without guidance, and where the person collecting is so set in his mind that those are good items that he will never ever question them, no matter how much information you throw at him. So this is something which is very sad, but I believe that intelligent people who collect and who observe these notes, this advice, can't go wrong.
What do you think about the statement that when we're collecting, we're really collecting ourselves?
Yes, in a way.
Because I feel like we buy certain things and then they change a lot of our perspectives and the way we look at things.
It has certainly worked that way with me because, and I can give you numerous examples, but let me just shoot off the ones that come to mind first. Travel. I love traveling. I used to do quite a lot of traveling as a teenager, first with my father, then on my own. When I got into this world of collecting and researching items, going abroad gave me much more satisfaction because I could relate to what I saw in museums, I could relate to what I saw sometimes in shops or in fairs or in markets. All that has made it far more interesting to travel. And believe me, my interests are pretty wide when it comes to history. So I'm pretty conversant with the Roman period and with what we call the Dark Ages, which weren't dark at all, and the Middle Ages. And I love history, and I'm continually reading about it. So when you go abroad and you have that information, which you can then see firsthand in objects, and you come back with more information, completing the story. That to me is extremely satisfying.
So it changed you in many ways.
Many ways, extremely. It opened me up completely.
Do you think it's the same for most collectors, or unfortunately no?
Yes, I've seen. Okay, let me put it this way. I've seen some very timid youngsters, people who are very unsure of themselves, becoming extremely confident in themselves because of this. I've seen it also adding a very good dose of discipline. Very important. And again, as collecting is a drug. Once you've got it, you can't stop. It also means that your energy and your finances are very focused. It also means that in younger people, it's a very good way of keeping them off, things which could actually harm them. So yes, I'm all for it. The positive element in it, in collecting, is huge, absolutely. Like in anything in life, there's always a downside, and one of them is like, let's say, space at home, later on arguments with the wife about, having too much things in one particular place.
Yes, we'll go into space and collecting. That's a very important thing. You had mentioned that some people go into collecting and it improves them. It's like a good drug, sort of. It's something good to get addicted to.
Yeah.
And that's something I discussed with Chris last podcast, because he said, okay, I told him, how do you justify spending €1,000 on a uniform? And he told me, listen, some people spend €1,000 on a television. I spent it on something worthwhile.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of collecting. I think we can agree is a sort of a crazy thing to do sometimes.
Absolutely, but as you rightly said, it's not about what you do to the object, what the objects do to you. And I can tell you one thing. I mentioned this case of, some youngsters who appeared to be very timid, but they became very confident. They were speaking to others about other objects, which they never did before. But there's also another element, which I did not mention, and I think we should give this quite a lot of importance. At least for me, it had a massive impact in my life, and that was, none of this came easy. I had to fight for it every single step of the way. And when I say every single step of the way, I'm not talking about, just having some funds to buy it. That's secondary. I'm talking about overcoming official hurdles. So I can start at the very first stage. Previously, there was no organization in Malta which represented collectors and target shooters. There wasn't. There were others that, were for, trap and skeet shooting, but it was more about the sport rather, nothing about collecting. In the mid-'80s, there was a parliamentary bill to amend the Import Duties Act. And I've always been very turned on when it comes to what's happening around me. So I follow a lot of things, what's going on. And as collectors, we live on an island, obviously. We are isolated. So there's the stuff which I can collect, which comes from local sources. But you will also depend on foreign sources. So bringing in, at the time, I don't know, medals, uniform items, documents from abroad was a very important part of our activity. But this bill was aimed at introducing an import duty on collectibles, which up till then had not existed. And when I saw this, I was very alarmed, and I was alarmed not from... This is interesting. That's why I said it brings out the best in you. This isn't about me being worried about what I would have to face. This is me being worried about a community that I didn't even know at that time. I said, but this is going to have a very bad impact on people who want to do this properly. It's also going to have a very bad impact on the wrong section of the population, the ones who are striving to bring to Malta and enhancing its heritage. So I said, but where am I going to start? How am I going to fight this? So I didn't have any other collectors to relate to in our field, I mean arms and militaria. So I reached out to those who were collecting, numismatics, people who were collecting coins, people who were collecting archaeological items. I reached out to them, and when I showed them this, nobody was aware of it, everybody was really concerned. So what are we going to do about it? We have to do something about it, we have to write. Okay, so who's going to lead it? Well, you told us about it, then you have to lead it. So suddenly I found myself in this situation of going from alarming people about what they could face to actually leading this myself. And very coincidentally, as you know, the former Prime Minister passed away, Carmen Bonici. He was Prime Minister at the time. It took me to a completely different level. Never before had I tried to meet a Prime Minister to discuss a subject like this. And it wasn't my problem, it was what I felt to be the community problem. I asked for a meeting, I got the meeting, spent, I would say, a good hour in front of him explaining what it's all about. And I convinced him because the bill was repealed. And that was the start of, I would say, the lobbying in favor of all this. It is that this is what gave me the drive to never give up. And eventually that would come to our rescue years later when we were lobbying for a new arms law. It's something which I involved myself in a lot, in a very big way. And the reason was that originally, if you wanted to collect militaria, that's no problem. But trying to import a firearm, and even an edged weapon at the time, a sword, a bayonet, whatever, was impossible, practically impossible. The laws forbade it. It wasn't that the law forbade it, but the Arms Ordinance, which was a colonial law, gave full discretionary powers to the Commissioner of Police. So the Commissioner of Police simply said, refused on grounds of policy, and that's it. And that's something which irked me a lot, and which I saw as very threatening to, not just to the community, but also to what we could do for our country. So I started lobbying. By the time we had formed our organization, did a lot of work. This is quite unbelievable. It took me 17 years of my life to do this. But eventually, the law changed. And I and my team played a major part in drafting that law.
This is when? Can you give a date?
Yeah. So 85, I had got together those people, and we had the first law repealed, the one about import duties. Then we started lobbying for at least a clearer police policy, which happened in 1996. So by that time, we got a policy which affected mainly collectible firearms. But that was not enough. I realized that unless the old law is repealed and a new one written from scratch, and the new one that is based on the European directive, and which basically has to be sensible in that it offers the security and the safety that every government would want, but would not in any way stop serious collecting from happening and conservation. So I worked very hard on that front. Eventually, the law changed in 2006. The current law has had minor changes, but it was mainly on that. And I thought that was it. I said, okay, I've done it. Now we have a good law. We can sit down and relax. Unfortunately not. It was not to be, because in 2008, the European Union started discussing amendments to the directive, which were very, very dangerous to us. I had got involved with a foreign organization based in the Netherlands, which is FISAC, the Foundation for European Societies of Arms Collectors, and I was the Maltese representative on its board. And they turned to me and they said, listen, you were very successful in your country. Can you deal with this? Can you front it? So suddenly it went from a national to an international level. And I was dealing with the European Union, with the rapporteur who was appointed for this particular topic. The course took about, I would say, just under 2 years until this was completed, but the end result was very, very satisfactory, very. And in fact, even the rapporteur, who was from the Greens, from the German Greens, and normally you'd say diametrically opposed to whatever we are interested in, she really understood what it was all about. She actually accepted my invitation to come to Malta and address the local community. So it worked well. And then again in 2015, because that's when there were the Bataclan killings in Paris, and 5 days later, actually less, the Commission published a proposal for a new directive, which was extremely damaging. It would have meant destroying items not only in private collections, but even in museums. And that's where I really had to work hard then to change the entire wording of that proposal. So I was working with the European Parliament, obviously representing FISAC, also working with the other sectors where firearms are involved, and I led that for 2 years. So it wasn't just the collectors then I was representing. But the outcome of it was that we managed to save a lot. And it was the time which gave me a lot of satisfaction for one very important reason. I was working hand in hand for the first time with the organization which represents museums. And we took a very common position on this. And that has helped a lot. That has really helped a lot.
I think I started my journey in firearms collecting towards the end of the last sort of legal issues with firearms, but it's good to remember the past that obviously nowadays we enjoy, or we're very fortunate to have good laws that allow us to follow our passions and research and do much more. So it's good to have that sort of perspective on the past and to see how we got to this point. You mentioned as well that you started obviously the fight and the passion for a community which didn't know existed. And of course, nowadays you still represent that community in many ways. Some people would say that that community which we're speaking of now, which is the firearm collectors or collecting community in general, is sort of a double-edged sword, because we have the same interests, but we also have interest in gaining an upper hand on each other, sort of. We get items that maybe, for example, you know what I mean?
Yes, but listen, competition is healthy.
Okay.
Competition is healthy.
But there is competition.
There has to be competition, because I will always find something that you happen to be looking for. It will happen sooner or later. How do you get around that? It's not easy, but with the right dose of, let's say, friendship, and with the right dose of reason, there are certain firearms, for instance, that a friend of mine has a very particular interest in. So I always give him first preference, because in doing so, it's not just a question of saying, okay, I'm letting go so that he can have it. He is building up a more complete picture than I am doing. So good luck to him. That's very, very important. You know, I may have some things which he has, but if something comes my way which is very much in his field, then I would rather he has it. But that's not something that you can overcome straight away or overcome easily. It needs time.
When we're speaking of collectors that have different sort of interests, it's very easy to reconcile. But when you have overlapping interests, I feel like there's a lot of tension then. Like some people are motivated to buy things just so they can get an upper hand, you know? So...
No, yes, that happens. And I've seen it, and it gets extremely silly at auctions especially. I've seen this. I've seen people bidding on something just because in the room there's somebody who knows his subject. So to them, the fact that he's bidding on it means that it's very good, and if it's very good, I must have it and not that guy. Yes, that will happen very often. There's also another attitude which I am strongly against. Okay, so I have something in my collection and something else comes up for sale. I'll get it too, so that the other guy can't have it. That's very, very wrong. I don't like that.
That happens a lot.
It happens a lot. It happens a lot. But at the end of the day, see it from the positive side. The person who's going to fight for that item has a very good motivation to take very good care of it and conserve it. My only regret is when I see good items being sold by people who I know can't give those objects all the attention they deserve. I've seen that, and it happens. But what can I do? I cannot stop them from doing it, but I will speak to them if I get the opportunity to do so, obviously.
I see. Maybe just a final perspective. Obviously, we mentioned the collection. We've been circling around it. Where do you keep your collection? How do you take care of it?
In various places, actually, not in one, because it's in 3 different places because of storage limitations. But to me, what's important rather than where I keep it is how I keep it. So the right ambient, not having any dust is practically impossible, but limiting it as much as possible, that's a must. Humidity is something which you have to tackle in Malta, definitely. So you need to have a very low relative humidity where the items are stored. And it's not a question about setting them up so that they look good. Conservation takes over everything. So if they're in a drawer and not actually seen, but they are well preserved and they are not, they are not accumulating any dust, which can cause a lot of damage because of the humidity. Those are factors which I give more importance to.
I don't know if you can comment on it, but you mentioned earlier that, for example, certain items get you in trouble with certain people because they take up space, or because they're too expensive, or because they're too strange. I have the problem with my mother. When I buy something, where are you going to put that? Put that, and maybe do you empathize with that?
Yes, it can happen. I mean, it happens very often, in fact. There are some, and I don't sound bad when it comes to wives, because I can tell you, I know a few wives who are very accommodating and there's absolutely no problem. But some others make it very difficult on certain collectors, even collectors I know, and they would not want one single piece appearing anywhere in the house, which is ridiculous. So they all have to be in a garage, for instance, or somewhere out of sight. That is silly, because I'm sure there are a lot of items in the house which belong to the other partner, and that partner enjoys seeing them on display. So why not this? There's nothing wrong in it. Absolutely.
And to go back to the point of these objects having a sort of aura, or being sort of like sacred relics a bit, sort of they have a certain presence associated with their materiality. Is that reflected in how you display those objects? Do you give more space to them, for example, or do you give extra protection to them?
Not really. I mean, as long as they are in the right ambient, and as long as they're in a safe place, I know exactly where it is. It could be something which is in a drawer, but I know exactly where it is. No, I wouldn't say so. That only happens if there is an exhibition, And obviously, an item that has a particular importance will be given a lot of attention, that yes. But not once they are being stored. There is a difference to a museum where you have everything in a showcase. And you go today and you will see this display, and you will go, I don't know, a year later, and you'll probably find exactly the same display. That sort of static museum, I'm not saying it doesn't appeal to me, because I always like seeing the items that are on display, but you're not getting the full extent out of it. I look upon my collection as a study collection, and this idea of a study collection is very important. It's something which gives me a lot of satisfaction when somebody like yourself, you take a very keen interest on the topic. So when you're coming over and we're discussing a particular item, it's not like bringing, any guest and person is seeing them. You're learning. So I'm disseminating that information. I'm learning about your interest in the topic, and I can give you some advice, and I can learn from you as well. There's no such thing. I dislike the word expert, but we use it very frequently. You're always learning, which I just happen to know a little bit more than somebody else, So I am in a position to pass on that information. But an expert, and this generally happens with people out there who say, an expert, okay, he knows it all. No, nobody knows it all. I've spoken to very, very big collectors who have a very big insight. 2 weeks ago, I was visiting a friend of mine abroad with a collection of over 30,000 pieces. And he said, well, thank you. I've learned some very interesting new things from you today. So it's not about the size of the collection, it's about the knowledge and how receptive that person is to receiving information, analyzing it, and forming his or her own views about it.
So obviously, wherever your collection is, or wherever there is part of your collection and there's people and interacting with them, it's a very special place for you. So it's a space of conversing with people, it's a space of learning, it's a space of appreciation. So how does being obviously surrounded by your collection make you feel? Is it like a special place for you? Do you hold it dear?
Absolutely. And usually, if I find some time, I'm quite busy, but if I find some time and I am surrounded by the collection, this happens very frequently, where suddenly my attention is on a particular object. I'm looking at it and I say, there's one thing which I may not have looked up about this thing, and literally I lose track of time. I lose track of time because I'll go to my library, suddenly my desk is mountains of books and my computer is open and I'm looking up things. So yes, this happens very, very frequently. And I could have researched that item, but a thought occurs and that thought sets me off on a different path and I want to find out something more about it.
So it's all about completing the story, sort of.
Yeah, about knowing more.
Yes.
And very importantly, writing it down.
Yes, it's something we neglect, and
we tend to overlook that
a lot because we can't remember everything.
Yeah,
we can't.
Yeah,
and it's important even to write down maybe the story of the collection itself, how it started with you and the helmet.
Yes. I generally keep, especially when it comes to provenance, because provenance is very, very important.
Yes.
So there are there are quite a few pieces in the collection where I have a provenance which goes back almost to the original owner and the people who have owned it in between. And that is excellent because you can really go back in time and you can really say, okay, here you have a textbook example. That's how it should be, as opposed to something that's just being out, on the market. You just happen to come upon it and you buy it without asking questions. That's different.
So the second story is important to you as well, who owned it before.
Oh yes,
It's important.
It's very much part of the story.
Okay.
Because first of all, you will come across some pretty unique characters who were involved in acquiring those pieces, and even that in itself is interesting. So I can think of one particular firearm, for instance, which ended the war as an unfinished prototype. It was one of 30 pieces. The Allies found them and they tried to complete it, but they didn't have the blueprints. The Allies split them up amongst themselves. Everybody took some. The Americans took a few, the Russians, the French, the British. But the American colonel who was involved in this also must have been thinking dollars at the time, said, okay, might as well have a couple of extra pieces of these, I can trade them, which he did. And somebody who was a very big collector from the Netherlands learned about it and did everything in his power to acquire it. After he acquired it, that I'm not so sure about whether he knew this or he got to know about it later. But at the end of the day, the result is the same. He discovered where the original blueprints were. They were in the UK. They were in the wrong department. He managed to acquire them. So then he had the unfinished set, the blueprints. He took them to the factory that had assembled the original one, and they finished it for him to the original blueprints. And out of these 30 pieces, this is the sole survivor which has been built completed to the full specification as designed, which is very, very important. Whereas all the ones that you see in the museums are not. And the people involved, the personalities who were involved, so this man who collected it, the British collector who acquired it from him, and I acquired it from the British collector. So it's all linked. It's one step after the other.
I think someone who might be listening that is only maybe starting off as a collector might be overwhelmed. Like, he might say, how the hell did he even learn or even let alone acquire such objects? Do you think collecting is something reserved for people that have a lot of time and money?
No, not in the least. Not in the least. I would say if you have the disposition to learn, it's sometimes not about the money either, because you can get given something. The important thing is the approach. So obviously somebody starting now, starting new, beginning to collect something small, I find absolutely no problem with that. It's a learning curve. You can't run before you walk. It's something which happens in time. And our lives are cycles at the end of the day. You start off as a teenager with some pocket money. You're a student. You're not making money. You're forking out money most of the time. You find something that you really want. Can you afford it? Maybe one way or another you manage to acquire it. In time you'll be working, you'll be earning money, you'll have the opportunity to buy things which you've always wanted to have. Yes, I mean, then you have a family. It's a bit more challenging. So, yeah, but if you have the passion and you can work within the parameters that your life offers you, there's a long way you can go.
And do you think you're collecting, you started off very young, and then obviously you progressed. You mentioned that life is like a cycle, so every part you can integrate collecting in a certain way in it. Do you think that collecting has mean the same thing for you throughout your life, or has reduced? There were periods where maybe you stopped? And
I can tell you I am just as passionate now as I was when I started, if not stronger. The only difference is that, but this is normal. It's not only about collecting. It's about anything that a person owns. The first pieces that you get when you have practically nothing, or the first pieces of a particular line of collecting which you haven't touched yet, those will also always hold a very particular. They occupy a very important part of you, because they are the ones that you've always wanted to have. You manage to get them. You'll think about them more. This is what happens. But this is not only in collecting. It's in anything. And I find that people who approach it in the way that, okay, they have a lot of money to invest, so they go out and they buy at one go, 50 pieces, just like that. Yes, fine, they manage to acquire 50 pieces, but it doesn't give them the insight that a gradual acquisition will ever give you. That's very important. There were cases when I was approached by extremely rich people and foreigners, who would say, I want to have a collection of firearms from this period. Right, okay. How do you want to go about it? No, just go and buy them at one go. And I laugh because it doesn't happen that way. It can be that you find a very nice collection and you have nothing for this person I'm talking, and you're buying it as a collection, you're transferring a collection with all that comes with it, the research. But from the personal point of view, you learn nothing that way. Nothing, absolutely nothing.
And there's that element that people like to show off with firearms or with any antique sort of.
Any.
They just to say I own that.
No, I don't have much respect for people like that. And it's not about the money. As I said, some persons will walk in with a lot of money in their pocket and say, yeah, I want this, and that. It leaves me cold. It's not about the money.
I think about 90% of my collection I acquired just because I knew what it was and nobody else didn't. So you find it somewhere in the rubbish.
That is a very important point, which you've just mentioned. It's not where you find it and its price or anything of the sort, but it's knowing about something which other people have missed.
I have a memory, for example, seeing a shell and seeing small notches in the end, and I knew that was a sub caliber and not a normal caliber, and it was priced the same way as everything on the whole table, and it was worth 10 times more.
Yeah.
And I got it for almost free.
Yeah.
So I see your point that
Once I picked a blue piece of glass from a bin, which was in not really an antique shop. It was more like the word regateer in Maltese. So somebody who hoards stuff, and buys stuff from estates. And there was this bin, and I saw this blue piece of glass, which attracted me, and it was curved. And when I picked it up, and I examined it closely, thankfully I have a very good eyesight, short distance, so I don't need a magnifying lens. And I said, oh, KM, Kriegsmarine. And there was the stamp on it. And I said, I think this is a mast light, because it had a brass edge, it was curved. And as you know, you have green and red, and the center is blue. This must be a mast light. And the old man who had thrown it away because it was cracked. I said, listen, where did this come from? I said, yeah, that is, when there were those German boats in Pietà, and the British were going to take them out to sink them, and we went on board, and we could take whatever there was on it, and I had picked it up from there. It was the mast light from one of the 7 Schnell boats that were in Pietà, which they were made seaworthy, 1947, just to take them out and sink them.
So these were mine-laying boats. They were used during the war in Malta.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. No, they were the German ones.
Yes.
The German ones. Yeah. They were captured and brought here.
Yes. So maybe someone who's listening in Malta, there are a lot of these stories you hear that people or the British were going to get rid of something, or even people that had something in their possession, they didn't know what it was. Yeah. And then collectors came in and they found it, and now it's in their collection.
Actually, it's a shame when people just throw away, and I'm in inverted commas, rubbish, because they don't understand it. Because you can't say, in Malta in particular, you can never say what there'll be. I mean, Malta has been the focal point of many struggles. So armies have been here, aerial attacks, troops continually, British troops, French troops. I mean, we had it all. So where did this stuff go? It's running around somewhere. A lot of things were obviously destroyed or taken abroad, but items remained here.
You reminded me of a question I wanted to ask you. Do you collect anything else besides militaria and antiques?
As a kid, before I started, I think I've always had the collector instinct in me, because you can say that my very first attempts at collecting was cigarette cards. But I do take an interest in many things. So things which they may have a family connection, or they may have a national connection. But I think I'm so focused on the main topic that automatically that restricts me, which is good. because otherwise it just gets out of hand.
Okay, I think we've talked about a lot of things, all of which were very interesting. I think it will be very hard to top this podcast, honestly, because because of the range and like how and you seem like you've thought about some of the things I asked you, and maybe we've discussed more about them today. Do you have anything you would like to add about collecting, and more importantly, do you suggest the next person? You have any in mind for the next person I should talk to?
Yes, definitely as a message for people who feel this urge to collect. The underlying message from my end will always be: do your research, know what it is you're collecting, appreciate it. The more books are very expensive, but sometimes it's better to have a very full library and a small collection than the other way around. It's very important to have. Okay, the internet is great. It's great as a reference to get started, but you still need good reference books by people who know their topic extremely well. And even that is not finalized, because there's going to be another author in the future who's going to discover something else, and more information is going to be added. So that's my message. Never ever separate acquisition from conservation from research. Those three go hand in hand. Now, as regards a person who is passionate and I think would be a fitting guest for your next podcast, I can think of several. But let me nominate a neighbor, Simon Cousins.
Yes, he's on my list, and
Yes,
maybe I'll push
yes.
him up now more.
All right.
Because
Okay.
yes, I think you have similar understandings about collecting, but I think you also diverge in some ways, which could be interesting even for you to listen in the future.
Okay.
Yes, so thank you very much for
Thank you, Nick.
being our guest, and we'll see you at the next one.
When my girl and I go out and join the park parade, arm in arm we stroll along, a happy man and maid.